Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm sure there's lots of better things you can do, like snowball fights and things like that, if you're in our part of the country tonight. However, you've taken the time to listen to me witter on about a bit of a labour of love. A lot of these talks that I've given over the past couple of years have had a fairly sort of serious academic nature to them. This one does in part as well. However, it feels like I'm speaking on home soil. So those of you with your Clive Harris bingo cards at the ready, you won't be let down. I will be mentioning London, of course, Gallipoli, of course, and also Charlton Athletic. So you won't have to wait too far to hear all three and tick them off. But there is a serious side to tonight's talk that we'll get to at the end. The main thing I wanted to kick off by saying is that the whole purpose of this talk is not to claim or even suggest that London is any better than anywhere else. And I really want to get that across. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. I just want to tell the story of a city that I'm very proud of, which my roots are firmly linked with, going back for centuries and centuries. And sometimes I feel that we don't actually sing loud enough about what we contributed, achieved and sacrificed in the 1418 war. And I'm sure wherever you're sat around the world watching this, this will be the same for your communities. So I don't want to take anything away from where you're from. I just want to tell the story of mine. The backdrop for this is the image you can see there, which is a rather wonderful book that was published during the Second World War, which was a collection of 500 short snippets, Cockney war stories as they were called, that had been submitted over the years to the London Evening News, and they were put into one compendium and released. And we're going to again listen to about 4 or 5 of those this evening, but I've used them as the narrative to tell the story of London's war from start to finish. So without any further ado, we shall start. And let's have a look, see if it's working. There we are. The area of London that I'm going to be talking about is roughly what you see in front of you here. It would be regarded as Greater London today. And the people I'm talking about would have been born there, spent large parts of their life there, or are certainly linked to this city. So London has always been a place that you don't necessarily have to have lived in the same house the whole of your life to have claimed it. It's somewhere, it's always full of migrants, people that come in, pass through and leave again. So we do have that turnover in population, which is quite an advantage to me when we are given a presentation like this evening. However, from my family's perspective, we really come from these 3 areas you see ringed. The Harrises in Greenwich, Charlton area, you can see away to the right there. For those of you who are not from London, the most famous places there would be the Cutty Sark, the Millennium Dome and the Royal Naval College. And then the on my mum's side, the Adamses, more of which we'll come to a bit later, they came from a little bit further to the west there, Deptford, Peckham, Lewisham, and both families actually crossed over because they arrived in this part of the world in the early 1700s to work in shipbuilding in Deptford Creek. By the time we got to the start of the First World War, elements of that Adams family had moved across to the area you see way off to the left there, which is sort of Shepherd's Bush, Acton, because there was a sizable woodworking population in that area of London, timber industry, which is where they'd come from, the Surrey commercial docks, working in the timber yards there and moved across. So they're the 3 areas that link me, my story with London. And it's within that map that we are going to refer in most of the people that we're talking about and instance we talk about this evening. So, but what would happen if you were to join the regular army and you came from the City of London? Well, it does have quite an outstanding military tradition. And we're not even going to mention the Household Brigade that you see on the left there. A number of the guards, regiments, battalions are always linked to London and as a result have a number of Londoners in them. But the line regiments that we have really line up like this. And I've put them over the map. So those of you that don't know the geography of London, it might make a bit of sense. In the northwest, we see the Middlesex Regiment, 4 regular battalions, and they actually raised numerous Kitchener battalions as well throughout the war. Over to the east, it'll be the Essex Regiment. We always have a handful of Essex people on board tonight, and of the Essex regiments that were raised, a considerable number of them, I think 9 of the battalions had sizable chunks of their ranks that were raised from the East End and the suburbs to the east of London. In the city itself, the Royal Fusiliers, or the City of London Regiment as they were called, which was one of the largest regiments in the First World War, numerous battalions raised, and most of those were people that were travelled in to work in the city or were born in the city itself. And then the East Surreys, they came in as far as Lambeth, Camberwell, Bermondsey. So really the eastern part of Surrey County, but lots of London battalions again raised from there. And finally to the area of southeast London, Deptford, Greenwich, and further afield, that would be the Royal West Kents. And between them, just these 5 cap badges raised 132 infantry battalions that would serve in the First World War. So that's just made up of the regular battalions and also the Kitchener raised battalions from the communities across that map, 132 infantry battalions. And then we need to talk about our territorial tradition, because it's almost unique, I think. There were 26 different battalions that made up the London Regiment. This came out of the territorial reforms of 1908. Previously, they'd all been local militias, and they were put under the one banner of the London Regiment. And very quickly, to run through them for you, the first 4 were given the cap badges of the Royal Fusiliers and pretty much linked from the city. The 5th were the London Rifle Brigade, and you can see on the left of your screen there, Answer the Call of the London Rifle Brigade. They were based in Bun Hill Row, which is right in the centre of the city. Now I have an affinity with those. I have on my shelves, I've got a complete set of London histories, but the history of the London Rifle Brigade that I own here is quite a special copy, in that you'll notice how charred and damaged it is. This was actually rescued by a veteran of the battalion, who was then a London firefighter during the Blitz, that went to Bun Hill Row that was on fire and rescued this copy off the shelf. So it's the battalion's actual copy of the book, Fire Damaged, quite, you know, irreplaceable really. So that's the 5th. The 6th, the City of London Rifles, sometimes known as the Fleet Street Pals, fantastic battalion, did so well up on the bluff and in 1918, and again linked to the city, as were the shiny 7th, the 8th, the Post Office Rifles, the 9th, the Queen Victoria Rifles, the 10th, the Hackney Battalion, sometimes known as the Hackney Gurkhas, 11th from Finsbury, 12th for the Rangers, 13th the Kensingtons, 14th London Scottish, 15th Civil Service, 16th Westminsters, 17th Popular Stepneys, 18th London Irish, 19th St Pancras Rifles, railwaymen from up and down the country, really, not just London, 20th my local lads, and then we go through to 26. I would list them all for you, but it might be a bit tiresome. But really what I want to get across is that these were 26 very different units, but shared the London regimental tradition. In total, between those 26 different units, they raised a further 78 battalions of infantry. Quite outstanding, really. Quite stunning numbers there. They were put into 4 divisions, of which you'll know fairly well. They are the 47th London, 56th London, 58th, and the 60th London Division. So 4 different divisions, and they alone, the London Regiment, would suffer 26,000 war dead in the Great War. That's London's territorials just on their own. We'll look at one brigade in particular to give you an idea of the traditions, and the one I've chosen is quite a well-to-do brigade. They're sometimes referred to as the Grey Brigade because their ceremonial walking out dress was grey uniforms. This was the Civil Service Rifles, the Queen's Westminster Rifles, the Kensington Rifles, and the London Scottish. So that's 13, 14, 15, and 16. There is a story, whether it's based partly in truth or totally in myth, it's still a great story, that when the Kaiser was visiting London prior to the war, a bit of a surprise visit to see his family members in the palace, He requested that we turn out the guard, and the Grenadier Guards were away on field exercises. So the King went to the Tower of London to turn out the Royal Fusiliers, and they were on their leave cycle, and he wasn't sure what to do. So he was left with the men of the Grey Brigade who turned out, and the Kaiser was so impressed with their smartness and their drill and their wonderful grey tunics that it may have inspired the reforms in his own army to wear that field grey. I think that might be stretching it apart, but what we do know is that he did present one of the battalions with a painting of himself, and that stood here. If you look on the left here, this is Davis Street headquarters for a long time for the London Regiment, and up until very recently was the mess for the Rifles. It's now turned into a luxury hotel. That was bombed in the Blitz, as you can see at the top there. The SETI of Westminster Archive photos showing the damage of the bomb. But the reason I've shown you those two images is because that painting of the Kaiser hung in the officers' mess. And then when war was declared on the 4th of August 1914, they turned the Kaiser inward to face the wall, as he was such a naughty boy. And he wasn't faced outwards again until the 11th of November 1918. That started a tradition that continued in the Second World War, where on the 3rd of September 1939, they faced the Kaiser inward. The painting survived the blitzing that you see above, and it's the top right-hand window where it would have been placed. And then they turned it back out again at the end of the Second World War. So the tradition would be when you came down to breakfast to eat, you'd ask, what's the weather like? And if the Kaiser was facing inwards, you knew the country was at war. Now, there's a serious side, of course, as well to the traditions of these battalions, in particular, the London Scottish. You can see those bottom right, that famous action of theirs at Gallivelt in October 1914, 31st of, not Gallivelt, sorry, Messines, 31st of October 1914, where they pretty much withstood a German advance to keep that section of the line secure, backed up by a number of Indian troops and cavalry regiments. Two famous members of the battalion that present that night was the actor Ronald Colman, who went on to have a great Hollywood career, and also the Basil Rathbone, who would be better known as Sherlock Holmes in later life. Now, the reason I chose this brigade in particular is one of the things I wanted you to consider is that despite those high casualty numbers that I mentioned, this brigade in particular is going to lose more men to commission in other regiments around the empire, the country, the globe, than they are to loss in combat. So because of their background, they were fairly well-to-do, they're very well educated, even the private soldiers, many of them would go on to be commissioned elsewhere. So a continual drain on resources. And that can be said by a number of the war-raised units across London. We can see the Public School Boys Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers there marching off to war with their Longley Enfields on the left. And that's accompanied by a rather charming cartoon that I picked up some 30 years ago now, which depicts a private of the London Regiment home on leave in 1916. He sat in front of the fireplace there with his father in the armchair listening to his stories of war. And it's entitled Our Exclusive Privates, and it shows Private the Honourable Aubrey de Vere, who's commenting to his dad, our officers aren't bad chaps, you know, but of course one couldn't mix with them after the war. That's a real statement on some of the civilian life or the quality of civilian life in London's privates, the candidates that we took in the regiment so across the city. Now, the first action we should look at is the one that I'm sure many of you will recognize here. Two great shots. First on the left there, a sort of artistic impression of the Germans advancing on the box girder bridge and no doubt heading for the swing bridge at Nimy on Mons. And of course, this was defended at the time by the 4th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. There were a number of battalions in the British Army, or regiments in the British Army, that had 4 regular battalions, and they all had fairly significant urban links. You, of course, have the Royal Fusiliers, and Middlesex Regiment, both recruiting heavily from London, the Rifle Brigade and King's Royal Rifle Corps that recruited from cities across the UK, and also the Worcestershire Regiment, who had a sizable population from Birmingham amongst their ranks as well. So urban links and centres enabled them to have these 4 battalions of regular troops, whereas most cap edges, of course, have 2. The 4th were pretty much the first in action here at Nimi on the 23rd of August 1914, and that wonderful photo on the right there shows some of the veterans returning to the spot in the 1960s, Old Contemptibles, and I'm sure many of us have been to that bridge and stood on it before and had our photograph taken. Actually, the first story I wanted to mention to do with this isn't a Londoner at all. I think it's always worthy when we go to Mons to mention him. It's this chap here. This is Oscar Niemeyer, Augustus Niemeyer, I should say, who swam across the canal under intense British fire and brought back a boat so that his patrol could cross. He managed to get the swing bridge back over and stop the, or managed to get the swing bridge back in action so that his men could swarm across and get onto the side of the British. There's no doubt that his actions, even though he was eventually killed, reopened the road for those and forced the issue for the 4th Royal Fusiliers, who as a result of that were pretty much on the back foot. I should mention that the commanding officer of the 4th Royal Fusiliers was Lieutenant Colonel McMahon, who was very, very keen on his musketry in ensuring that all of his men were able to fire the minimum of 16 to 18 rounds a minute before they go to France. And unfortunately, a man who no doubt would have gone on to greater things and risen through the ranks is killed by Christmas. And whenever you're next in the St George's Chapel, I'm sure you recognise this image here, St George's Chapel in Ypres, the window to the right there actually commemorates the fact that Lieutenant Colonel Mahon was killed in the First Battle of Ypres and didn't see out the first year of the war, but was a very, very popular commander in the battalion. Further down to their right, well, sorry, I should mention that this guy, of course, first real London that we're going to talk about, Sid Godley, born in Willesden, northwest London, but spent most of his life in southeast London in Sidcup. Sid had a fascinating story himself in that he was one of the heroes of Mons, there's no doubt about that. The account from the Times, and I'll read that out to you, says that the machine gun crews were constantly being knocked out, and that's the artist's impression, really, you see on the left. It shows a Vickers gunfire, and actually there were Maxim guns the battalions were equipped with at the time, but that's firing across the railway bridge towards the Germans coming down towards Nimi, and in the background there you can just make out some of the coal slag heaps that are synonymous with this part of the battlefield. And so the Times report goes on that the machine gun crews were constantly being knocked out, so cramped was their positions, that when a man was hit he had to be removed before another could take his place. The approach from the trench was over the open, so whenever a gun stopped, Lieutenant Maurice Death, an Irishman by birth, very talented young officer, went to see what was wrong. To do this called for no ordinary courage. To repeat it several times is only achievable with real heroism. Death was badly wounded on the journeys, but he insisted on remaining on duty as long as his crew could fire. In fact, it was said that he was fussing over his guns. The third time he was wounded was quite fatal, and he was one of the first officer to be awarded the Victoria Cross. It was, however, Godley that stepped up at this stage. Both guns had ceased firing. All the crew had been killed, and if there was anyone else who knew how to fire a machine gun, it was Godley that came forward. He did manage to rearm the gun, get it firing again before it was put out of action. He then decided to chuck the working parts of any use over the side into the canal, but himself being badly wounded soon fell into the hands of the Germans and would spend the rest of the war in prison, and actually was given the news of his Victoria Cross award by his German prison guards. It's also been suggested that the image of Godley getting off of a train in captivity that was widely used in the British press, sort of a very tough-looking British soldier with big moustache and bedraggled hair, not like the nice image we see in the photograph here, was the inspiration for Bruce Bairnsfather's character on the right there of Old Bill. How much truth is that? I'm not quite sure. What I do know that is his medals, Victoria Cross, did come up for sale in 2012 and sold for the princely sum of £276,000. To the right of the 4th Royal Fusiliers was another London battalion, the 4th Middlesex Regiment. They were down at Oberg, the railway station. Now, many of you would have been there today, and it's quite a humble memorial that's made up of bricks taken from the railway station building we see here. The layout's changed. The canal's a lot wider. Industrialisation has changed that over the last century or so, but it was here in the road that runs back up towards Mons itself that was lined with the men of the 4th Middlesex Regiment. They appear in a number of photographs shown of the Battle of Mons, perhaps most famously the image you see on the right there, which is young Arthur Carter. They always look immaculately dressed. Now, this is down in part to their adjutant. When they arrive in France, as they're marching through the streets, French girls would quite often break from the crowd and in exchange for a kiss want a cap badge or a shoulder title or a souvenir or a button or that sort of thing. But in the ranks of this battalion, the adjutant was a keen gambler and actually brought across with him a number of packs of playing cards with the regimental crest on. So when someone ran towards one of his men, he would quickly usher them away and give them a 2 of clubs with the regimental badge on. So goes the story. So that when they arrived in Mons, they were absolutely impeccably turned out. And there's no doubt they fought an incredible action here at Oberg railway station. In fact, one of the men of the battalion who largely remains unknown, there's a few suggestions people might know who it is, but largely we think he's unknown and is buried in San Symphorien Cemetery, held the Germans at bay for quite some distance from the roof of the railway station while his men managed to escape back up towards Binchy Crossroads and try and start the long retreat that would take them all down to the Marne. So impressed were the Germans with the performance of the Middlesex Regiment that they buried them in San Symphorien Cemetery, and I'm sure many of you watching tonight would have visited quite a stunning cemetery on its multiple layers and whatever that's set out. And they put up this memorial here that refers to them as the English soldiers of the Royal Middlesex Regiment. Probably more of a mistake as opposed to anything else, because of course this isn't a Royal Regiment at all. However, the War Graves Commission kindly have left it as it stands to say the men of the Royal Middlesex Regiment, with all the way around them is the members of that battalion and a couple of Irish soldiers as well that surround them. They were commanded at this action by a chap who did survive. This is Charles Patrick Imat Hull. Now, Hull was born in Kensington in 1865, initially commissioned into the Royal Scots Fusiliers and had served in the South African War and in the Boer War at the Siege of Ladysmith. He commanded the 4th Middlesex at Mons. He went out to France with them and saw them throughout 1914. And then in early 1915 was brought back and promoted rather rapidly from Lieutenant Colonel to Major General, so that he took command of the 56th London Division. Now, this was one of those territorial divisions I mentioned earlier. That's their logo you see on the top right-hand side there that resembles, references Wat Tyler's dagger. We have another symbol that refers to Wat Tyler's dagger a bit later in the talk. This is a common reoccurring theme across London, and of course it sits on the City of London crest. He commanded this division at Gommecourt, which was a fairly disastrous day for the division in number of casualties, but you can't take away the achievements that the men of the 56th Division managed to achieve in the first few hours of the attack by claiming all of their objectives and what have you before they started to withdraw back to their own lines. And that's no doubt to his planning. Hull was very well thought of as a result of his time here, and the reward actually for Gommecourt was to fight again in the September up at Comballs. But this time, this was the division that was chosen to play with, train on, and try and break tanks, when the rest of the world, it was a secret. The 56th London Division actually did get to trial with the tanks to see how they could mutually cooperate together on the battle space. He was only withdrawn from the warfare in 1917 when he underwent major surgery. He was by this stage getting on, is sort of in his 40s or so, and he returned to France untimely, really, in March 1918, where he took command of the 16th Irish Division. This is probably the low point of his career. There was a cracking division, the 16th Irish Division, but it's fair to say that Hull didn't really have the same ability to command them as he did, and of course he walked straight into the London regiments. He walked straight into the March offensive, and that division was pretty much wiped out and disbanded shortly after as a result of the amount of casualties they sustained in the fighting in March 1918. As a result, Hull rejoined the 56th London Division and remained as their boss right through to the armistice. And he also had a son that's worthy of mention as well, Sir Richard Hull, who was the commander of the 1st Division in the Second World War in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe, who would go on to become a field marshal. So quite a talented family, the Hull family there. Now we should go to our first of the tales from 500 Cockney War Stories. And this one was, the joy of this book is that every veteran that wrote in, he gives their name and their addresses. So you can quite literally trace them. I don't intend to do that for everyone, but in this case, you can see this is William White, who was a gunner who lived at 29 Clive Road there in Collier's Wood, SW19, just not far from Tooting. You can see it marked on the map and the sort of the house he lived in. Now, he told the story of the time at Mons, when they were under attack, that says it was on the Mons Condé Canal on the afternoon of 23rd of August 1914. Our artillery had just opened up when a tiny Cockney trumpeter, who could not have been more than 15 years old, came galloping up to us with a message. "How are the gunners going on, boy?" said our captain. "Knocking them down in their thousands, sir," replied the lad. "Good," said the captain. "Yes, but they're coming on in their millions," replied the boy as he rode away to his battery. That was a plucky lad, that. So there we are, they're coming on in their millions. The next major action for the BF, of course, was the Battle of Locato, 26th of August, a far bigger battle than the one at Mons, 7,500 casualties. Really, this is where Smith Dorrien's corps, who had fought most of the fighting at Mons, and we haven't got time to go in the entire retreat from Mons. However, these guys decided to stop the bottom end of the Forest of Moormal, make a stand on the crossroads. This was, of course, on the anniversary of the Battle of Cressy. And the other historical reference there is Smith Dorrien supposedly telling his men, "Remember Isenlander, boys," as in don't fight to the death, fight to the last round. But nevertheless, they did fight. They fought very, very fiercely. And we can see, or we know from this fighting, that the field guns were up in amongst the infantry. At this stage, we weren't all necessarily fighting from sunken lines and firing off the lanes and firing off the map. One of the heroes that day, of a number of them in the King's Own Yorkshire Infantry, was this chap here you can see on the left, Frederick Holmes. Now, he came from Abbey Street in Bermondsey. So just to those of you that aren't from London, let me just try and paint a picture of exactly what Abbey Street, Bermondsey would have been like when he grew up there in the 1890s. If you've ever seen Oliver, the classic film, where Fagin's Den is, that's the sort of area he would have been in. You know, tight riverside communities, tall buildings, narrow alleyways, gaslit, that sort of stuff, full of Herberts and ruffians. And certainly Frederick Holmes carries that quite well. He was joined the army in 1907, was a pre-war regular, and was recalled to the King's Own Yorkshire Infantry in 1914. He actually had 7 children. And he was awarded the Victoria Cross on the 26th of August for quite an outstanding action, really. The citation says that Lance Corporal Holmes discovered Bugler Hawthorne lying in the open with both legs broken. Picking him up, he carried him out of danger, and about 2 miles from the trenches handed him over to the stretcher bearers. Hawthorne later returned to his battalion and was killed in action in 1918. Holmes then ran back to his previous position. On the way, he came across an 18-pounder battery that was out of action. One of the detachment was still alive, although wounded, and begged Holmes to save it. Holmes limbered up the gun and succeeded in evading the advancing Germans. Now, this sounds like a boy's own story. Here you have an infantryman carrying someone off the field of battle and then returning back to the front line, finding a disused or a damaged artillery piece with horses, saddling it up and riding it away to safety. However, in the confusion of battle, it wasn't quite that straightforward. Originally, Holmes was certainly not, if not arrested, detained or set to one side for deserting the battlefield. People wanted to know why there was an infantryman leaving the scene of the battle on a horse towing a gun. And this was certainly compounded by the fact that the surviving battery member had fallen off en route and was nowhere to be seen and was never found. However, once his story was sort of told, this was somehow amended or upgraded to a Victoria Cross. It's a little bit of controversy in there, is that when you read about the Victoria Cross, the commanding officer of the Yorkshire, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, who attends the reception in Bermondsey, civic reception that's held for Holmes, actually comments that he regretted putting him forward for the Victoria Cross after the civic reception. Now, I can only assume from that, and people I've asked haven't been able to tell me any further, that he had a few beers and decided to tell a few home truths, which is something that South London families, and I'm from one, have a tendency to do, is after a few beers, that's when we decide to start wanting to talk to each other. We should say that he wasn't immediately removed from the battalion. He did serve down on the Aisne in 1914, where he picked up a further decoration and was wounded again. Recovering from the wounds, he actually was commissioned and served out in Mesopotamia, in Basra. He then came back to live in London for quite some time and had a passion for magic, actually. My favorite bit about the Holmes story is this thing that he took, this famous photograph that you see in many books on his travels across India, which is of the Indian rope trick in practice. I mean, quite an amazing photograph, and he would show this at various magic conventions, what have you. Of course, now with the aid of technology and maybe a little bit more common sense, this has been disproved as a bit of a fake, and it involves bamboo and what have you. But at the time, a Victoria Cross holder was putting that out as being proof that the Indian rope trick is real magic. Quite an intriguing character, I think you'll agree. So what was happening back home at the time when we were fighting in Locato? Well, there we see on the left-hand side, the London Opinion. This only apparently ran for about 2 weeks, this image, Your Country Needs You. So far from being plastered across the country on every billboard, it appeared on the cover of a London journal for a couple of weeks, and it's certainly since the First World War has captured the imagination of the population as representing the Great War. But enough of them did answer this call of Kitchener's steely eyes staring at them. And you can see all across London, there were a number of recruiting offices had to be closed because there were too full. Crowds turned out on the street to enlist in anything they can. One of the people that tried to enlist was a chap called Albert Tingey. Now, he got together a group of men who were all professional golfers and decided they were going to raise a battalion. And they decided the meeting place they were going to have was going to be on the steps of Trafalgar Square. Now, you can see here from these two images, one with Edward Landseer's lions in the background, that there was already lots of recruiters that beat them to it. So it became almost impossible for them to enlist in anyone. Initially, the idea was they're going to join the Guards. Well, the Guards said, we're not taking any Kitchener volunteers, we're regulars and we're full. Then they went down to the Tower of London to join the Royal Fusiliers, and the queue, those of you that know the area, is right back up Lower Thames Street past the Hung, Drawn and Quarter pub. So they said, oh, this is a complete waste of time, let's go for a bite to eat. So they went off to Quaglino's or wherever it was, somewhere in Jermyn Street, when suddenly the place was full of men, all with the same idea of being enlisting on the early days and not find anyone to join, when a table jumped up and ran for the door. So Tingey went over to one of the waiters and said, where are they going? And the waiter said, oh, they're going to catch the train to Winchester, sir. Apparently no one lives there and they're recruiting too. So Tingey and his men jumped up, got on the train down to Winchester, where they pretty much must have overwhelmed the local population with train after train of Londoners turning up just to join the army. And as a result, they managed to get in to the 13th Rifle Brigade. And this was given the nickname at various time of being Niblick's own. Now, what really encouraged these golfers to enlist was a short clip that appeared in Golf Monthly magazine that says, "The war hangs like a deathly pall over the land of golf. On the eastern seaboard of Britain, the peaceful resorts are largely in the hands of the military authorities. Vast entrenchments have been constructed and the adjacent ground turned into tented fields. It is no purpose of ours to discuss the cause or significance of the terrible campaign. Those of us who have travelled in Germany have graven, imprinted in our memory, the all-being worship of the military spirit, the joy of the people of the fatherland in the rattle of the scabbard and the clank of the soldier's step." So some real propaganda there. One of the things that encouraged them to list. In fact, in golf terms, in October 1914, the Royal and Ancient decided that all German and Austrian club members across the country be dismissed or thrown out. And in fact, I think one of those only re-allowed Germans to join sometimes in the centenary of the Great War. I seem to remember it being on the news. Harold Hilton, who was quite influential, he said that no caddy between the ages of 19 to 35 should be given a single job or the slightest encouragement to be about the links. My advice to golf clubs is to assist these young fellows to get to the nearest recruiting station. Safe to say that Harold Hinton was not within the 19 to 35 bracket, so that didn't relate to himself. But there was problems with golf generally, decline in membership because people were enlisted. A number of them had bought war bonds and spent up their cash reserves. A number of the courses were reclaimed for use as military purposes. In fact, the 56th London Division trained on the wide open fairways of Woking Golf Club. And rubber costs, something we don't think about. Rubber costs went up 12-fold. In fact, it was such a problem, there was an organized gang of local Herberts that would go onto golf courses, steal golf balls, and then give them to criminal gangs who would then sell them for a higher price. And there was a Metropolitan Police detective team put in to break this ring of golf ball stealers from across the capital. For the 13th Rifle Brigade, when they arrived in France or in Belgium, they actually had a fairly slow start to life. In fact, they designed and built an 18-hole golf course in the Ypres salient in and around the Dickiebusch area. When Haig took over as Commander-in-Chief, this was such a problem losing his staff officers to go off and play golf that he invited Charles Mayo and Albert Tingey, you see here, up to his headquarters to build a shorter 9-hole course so that his men would only be lost for an afternoon instead of a whole day. It's when they arrive on the Somme that it gets serious. And I just wanted to point out that a number of those initial volunteers that turned up at Nelson's column to enlist were soon casualties. Corporal James Scarfe of Doncaster, Fred Jolly and Corporal Seward, his caddy, both wounded. Corporal Macy of Little Hampton, Rifle Robertson from Leicester, and Rifleman Tolson of Fort Paul. Now, there is quite a serious side to this, in that I wanted to point out that if you're a professional sportsman and you're injured, it pretty much ends your career. Whereas if you're a train driver, a bus conductor, you could be slightly wounded and you may well go back to that job at the end of the war. But when you're a professional sportsman and athlete, any of these injuries is very serious indeed. Perhaps one of the most significant casualties in the world of golf was Lance Corporal Ernest Jones, who lost a leg. Meant he couldn't play golf anymore, but instead he went to America, became a golf coach, and is widely regarded as the man that shifted the balance of power from UK to American golf through his training methods. He was also a member of this battalion. And in fact, by 1918, only 2 of those initial 26 volunteers that went to enlist were able to return back to the UK and play golf again. Just aside from that, quite interesting, this is their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Strode Jackson. He was a character in his own right, in that he was a magnificent sportsman: hockey, football, boxing, tennis, cricket, all sports, but also a runner. He wasn't chosen to run for Great Britain in 1912 in Stockholm, but he enlisted under a private entry agreement and actually won the 1500 meters, which is widely regarded as being the greatest race of all time. So their commanding officer had a gold medal from the Stockholm Olympics. He would go on to be awarded the DSO 4 times and reach the rank of brigadier. So then we move on to Gallipoli in 1915. There's a number of London contributions at Gallipoli, not least in the initial landings with the Royal Fusilier battalions that come ashore. But really, I wanted to focus on the Mounted Brigade here, because this is a forgotten battle. The 21st of August 1915. We could have a whole evening, a whole webinar. In fact, I think I've given one talking about the fighting for Green Hill and Cimeter Hill, the largest battle of the Gallipoli campaign, the last major battle of the Gallipoli campaign, 21st of August 1915. Amongst them was the London Mounted Brigade, and they had to cross the Salt Lake. You can see that painting there under fire. It was crusted over. Since they've widened and moved the cut, we never get the Ceylon content, so it doesn't cross over as much as it did in 1915. But then you could walk across towards Green Hill and Chocolate Hill in the distance. When they got there, they were to take over the newly won positions captured by the 29th Division. Of course, on arrival, that attack has failed and they're thrown straight into attack. So it really is a baptism of fire for them. The amazing photo you see on the right there, Lieutenants Crocker and Marsden, is actually taken crossing the Salt Lake on the 21st of August 1915. These are two of the members, or two officers in the London Mounted Brigade. I really like the fact that you can see them there with Lee Enfields slung over their shoulders. Common sense soldiering, not standing out like officers. All too often we're hearing about them armed only with a stick, but here they're blending in almost like they're men. Crossing the Salt Lake. Another chap that you can see the picture of him there in his RAF or Royal Flying Corps uniform was a member of the brigade as a young officer, and that is William Wedgwood Benn from Hackney. Now, he was obviously the father of Tony Benn, and he writes of the attack, their morale and enthusiasm was high. This would be their first action, in fact, the first time under fire for most. The spectacle of the yeomen of England and their fox hunting leaders striding in extended order across the Salt Lake and the open plain, unshaken by the grueling they were getting from shrapnel, which caused many casualties, is a memory that will never fade. Now, the action is probably best known for the Victoria Cross that was awarded to the Berkshire Yeomanry. You can see here on the Burning Hill. This is obviously Trooper Potts that appeared in Victor Comic, which was definitely, as I was growing up, was one of the main primary sources that I used to read to learn about history. Certainly got me interested in the Great War, Victor Comic. But another person that witnessed it would have been John Coomer, a Royal Engineer who lived at Thornton Avenue in Thornton Heath, which is where my great-grandfather lived for a while. It's in sort of southeast London there. And his recollections are a lovely little tale that says, there were several stretcher cases in the field dressing station at the foot of Chocolate Hill, awaiting removal by the ambulance, including a Cockney trooper in the dismounted yeomanry. He had a bandage around his head, only one eye was visible, and his left arm was bound to his breast with a sandbag. His rapid fire of Cockney witticisms had helped to keep our spirits up while waiting, and he had a comment for almost everything. Suddenly a strafe started and a shrapnel burst among us. Confusion, shouts and moans, and then a half hysterical, half triumphant shout from the Cockney. Lummy, one in the blinking leg this time. I got old Nelson beat at last. That sort of spirit there. Someone who would have got Nelson beat is this chap, one of my great heroes, Eric Kipper Gascoigne Robinson from Greenwich, southeast London. Had seen service in the Boxer Rebellion in China, where he was twice wounded. That's where he met Roger Keyes, and narrowly escaped death when he was posted from the live bait squadron the day before the sinking of the Hogue, the Abakur and the Cressy to join the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. There was a real problem in the February of 1915 in that the mine clearance vessels to the gates of Gallipoli and Dardanelles Straits were not able to get to the minefields because they were being fired upon from the forts on either side. and we weren't able to send ships up to take on the forts on either side because we hadn't cleared the mines. So the only answer to this was to land troops ashore and raid, and Roger Keyes set up Kipper to do the task. He knew he was the man for the job. And on the 26th of February, he took part in this Turkish land battery that took out not only a fort, but that photograph you see at the bottom there. I mean, Gallipoli's stunning, isn't it? This is a Victoria Cross action in 1915 on the supposed site of Achilles' tomb. And I find this incredible. Anyway, he lands with a group of men dressed in naval whites. They rush towards the first battery that he destroys. In fact, the first land casualty of the Gallipoli campaign is one of his men, a chap called Sergeant Turnbull in the Royal Marines. He decides then they too many of them put themselves at risk, so he decides to attack a battery on his own. And he dodges bullets in his white uniform until he crests the rise unhurt. And a few minutes later, he started back, having destroyed the field guns and completely ambivalent to any of the firing that's going on around him. And there's a wonderful quote for his Victoria Cross that says he was said to be strolling around under heavy rifle fire like a sparrow enjoying a bath from a garden hose. This wasn't the end of it, though. A new submarine was in town, the E-class, and unfortunately, E15 had got itself stuck quite close to a Turkish fort. Now, then we needed to do a rescue or recovery. Well, in fact, neither. We needed to destroy the E15 before it fell into Ottoman hands. So HMS Majestic, which is where Kipper Robinson was posted, was one of those that put forward a crew to attack in this really quite strange, slow-moving vessel that you see there on the left, which had one torpedo fitted alongside with a fellow crew from the Victory, and they were to rush in, launch their torpedoes and destroy the E15. Now, they soon got caught in a blaze of searchlights and came under heavy fire from Turkish artillery and machine gun fire. Lieutenant Goodwin, who was one of the boat's commanders, decided to attack. The first torpedo missed, but the boat then was struck by a shell that blew away much of Goodwin's stern. He was quite mortally wounded at this stage, or one of his crew was, sorry, and it was irreparably damaged. It was sinking fast. However, Goodwin continued on, and this time hit the submarine with his torpedo, and you can see the hole there on the right-hand side through the conning tower. It was then the HMS Triumph under Robinson came into it. He decided to steam straight to the aid of the stricken vessel that was sinking fast, and he rescued the crew before getting them away to Mudros. It says that the Turks fired 500 heavy caliber rounds at these two boats in just a few minutes. And a German observer who was working as a recovery wreck diver on the E15 said, "I have never in the course of the war seen an attack carried out with such pluck and such fearlessness." Now, he has his own Victor comic story there, the end of the E15, which mentions Robinson in it, which is quite something. There's suggestion that he could have been awarded a bar to his Victoria Cross, but that wasn't the case. But he continues in service. He's largely responsible for training the crews at Zeebrugge. He then is in command in the Caspian Seas and also takes part in the Atlantic convoys in World War II. Quite a legend. Now, I had a relative in the Royal Naval Division in Gallipoli as well, but just twofold. I won't read you the whole of this letter. This is my great uncle Arthur Hearn. It's my great grandmother's brother, who was in Hawk Battalion. You can see in the envelope there that was written to him by his sister, and that's my great grandmother. Top right, she's actually wearing a Hawk Battalion brooch there on her blouse. But she herself was doing her part, because you can see from this letter that she was working in a munitions factory in Acton, and it says, "Very pleased to you are keeping well, in good health, and that you are still making shells and bullets for us, so I expect it will be hard work for you. Keep up with plenty of shells and bullets, and then we can keep back that wicked beast of the Kaiser of Germany."
Let's hope God will give him what he has asked for. Arthur actually would go on to be wounded in the Somme fight in the Ancre Valley, and that pretty much ends the war, and also ends our relationship with him. My great-grandmother fell out with him because she wanted to marry a soldier. He didn't want to, and they never spoke again. And so I don't really know much about the guy after the war ends. And what makes it harder is he joined up under his mum's maiden name as his own name. So as opposed to his own name, so it's quite hard to trace. But there we are, 63rd Royal Naval Division, a Londoner, like many of them in Hawk Battalion. And one of the chaps he would have known, who was not often associated with London, but should be because he was born in Richmond, is Bernard Afreyberg. Afreyberg obviously moved to New Zealand as a child, so they can rightly claim him as one of them, but I'm claiming him one as mine as well. Was a dentist initially when he left school and was turned down from the army a number of times for a commission. So instead went off to fight under Pancho Villas as a mercenary in the Mexican Revolution. When war was declared in 1914, he wanted to return to London to enlist to raise the funds to get home. He entered a swimming race in Los Angeles and won it. That got him as far as New York, and then he entered a prize fight and won it, and that got his fare back to London. He went to see a pal to Churchill and got his commission into Hood Battalion. He did take part at Antwerp in September 1914, even though he was uncommissioned at the time. Shouldn't really have been there. He was a coffin bearer at Robert Brooke's funeral, and at the just the night before the landings at Gallipoli, he swam ashore himself, dropped off by a boat, threw a few pyrotechnics around at Belair to try and convince the Ottomans we were landing there in a feint, and for that was awarded Distinguished Service Order before eventually be awarded his Victoria Cross in the fighting in the Ancre Valley on the Somme in November 1916. He then became a brigadier in April 1917. At the time was suggested to have been the youngest general in the army. This was 58th London Division, actually, not 55th as it says there. He was wounded at Passchendaele, though and was awarded another DSO, and returned to them in January 1918, and eventually got himself posted. And on the 11th of November, I find this quite incredible, 11th of November, he led a cavalry squadron of 7th Dragoon Guards to seize a bridge at Lessines at 10:57. In doing so, he captured the bridge, was awarded a bar to his DSO, took a number of Germans prisoner, who then said, well, it's armistice has gone 11 o'clock, and he pointed out that it was 10:57, and the poor fellas remained prisoners of war for about 8 or 9 months as a result of that timekeeping. And then, of course, we go on to the Second World War and the New Zealand forces, and also on through to Monte Cassino. But Afreyberg, quite a character. Back home, there's a lot more to keep our minds busy in London. This wonderful picture here of a school classroom. If the Zeppelins come, keep indoors. Put lights out and keep quiet. British means pluck. Now, there's certainly people within the WFA that know far more about the subject than myself, Steve Hunnister, Ian Knight, and what have you, that write fantastic stuff on the air raids in London in the First World War. I was quite surprised to know that it's roughly 50-50. There were 50 airship raids across the country, of which 557 people were killed from airship or Zeppelin raids. And they dropped 1,358 tons of bombs and lost 30 airships or Zeppelins in the process. Whereas aircraft raids was only 52, but a higher percentage of deaths, 857, far more tonnage dropped from the aircraft than the airships, but a lot more loss, 62 aircraft shot down. If we look at London, some of the evidence still exists today. If you were to come out of Farringdon Market and walk up towards the Betsy Trotwood pub, you'll come to Zeppelin House. This is actually the drill hall of the 6th City of London Rifles, and you'll see on the plaque there that the premises was totally destroyed by a Zeppelin raid during the First World War in September 1915 and rebuilt in 1917. If you're walking along the embankment,
and you can see damage from one of the Gotha bomber raids on the base of Cleopatra's Needle. That's bomb damage from the First World War. And there's actually a bump in the road that my black cab friends complain about every time they drive up there, where the bomb crater was never properly filled in. That map of London there shows the extent of the aeroplane and Zeppelin raids. In fact, the Zeppelin ones, you can actually see long trails as they drop their bombs coming in. I don't know if my marker stands up on you or not, but you can see there to the southwest of London from Tooting, Streatham, all the way in. You can see as they were dropping their bombs. Perhaps the most significant raid was the Theatre Land raid in October of 1915. This was actually the first time that London's air defence batteries were used. There were 40 casualties alone, probably the most significant incident of the entire Great War in the UK from air raids when the Lyceum Theatre was hit. There was 5 Zeppelins, including one, the L-13, that was captained by Heinrich Mathy, probably the most infamous Zeppelin pilot of them all, was known across the UK as the baby killer. But was a man that was very much concerned about his own well-being. He wrote home just after raiding London, "It is only a matter of time before we join the rest. Everyone admits that they feel it. Our nerves are ruined by mistreatment. If anyone should say that he was not haunted by visions of burning alive, then he would be a braggart." And that prophecy came to become reality when he was shot down over Potter's Bar by Second Lieutenant Tempest just a few weeks after he wrote that. One of his last raids is you can see on the right there. It's incorrectly captioned August 14th, but it shows bomb damage on the top of Blackheath. I love that photograph because it just shows the interest of the locals. I should say that what was bombed is cleared away and made way for a stunning arts and crafts building that's still there. If you ever get a chance to see it, the picture like Mary Wells Picture Library, stunning building. But I love that photograph of the copper there minding the premises, and then those young South London Herberts out the front there. You can see the one in the middle almost just about to flick the V up at the cameraman. That could be a scene from today, really. In fact, the caps have come back into fashion, haven't they? And then on the left, we see another incident that's worthy of mention in the capital, which is the Silvertown explosion. This is the 19th of January 1917, 6:52 in the morning. Silvertown factory where explosives are being made by the ICI works. 50 tons of TNT went up. Can you imagine these days? Ammunitions factory in the heart of an urban city like that. 73 people being killed, 400 injured. The worst damaged part was actually the married quarters of the fire brigade that were called out. So a lot of the firefighters' families were killed in that explosion. It must have been absolutely horrific. It was reported that the explosion was so severe they actually overturned a cab in Pall Mall and blew in some of the windows of the Savoy Hotel. In the court of inquiry, it's worth mentioning that a Mons veteran was found guilty of robbing jewelry and gold teeth from the victims found in possession of these items, and was later let off because he'd been at Mons and was suffering from shell shock. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that stuff was happening in those days. Where it affected my family was that it caused a tsunami. Water, large wave came across to southeast London, directly affecting these two chaps here. This is my two great-grandfathers on the left and the right. John Harris, who was living in Charlton at the time, his family were rehoused up to Lee Green, the Tiger's Head pub, because their house was flooded. Sorry, on the left there, he was in the Army Veterinary Corps, a pre-war regular of Queens West Surreys. And on the right, Charlie Adams, my great-grandfather, who was a gunner from Camberwell, who was also serving in France at the time the news of the Zeppelin raids and what have you were coming about. They would both been aware of this chap who was their local MP, Ian Hamilton Benn, the MP for Greenwich. He was the commanding officer of the 20th London's Woolwich and Blackheath Battalion, and also had a lieutenant commander role in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He took up the latter and was awarded a DSO for his actions at Ostend and Zeppelin Raids, in charge of these motor launches, and was very well thought of by Roger Keyes, who initially distrusted him for being a politician. This segues me in nicely, because Ian Hamilton Benn, not only being the local politician for Greenwich, was also the president of Charlton Athletic Football Club. Now, these really, once Arsenal had moved to North London because it was a nicer part of the world in their own eyes, and they're still there, Charlton filled their gap, filled their void, and rose through the ranks. By 1913 season, they were winning everything, sweeping all before them. Had it not been for the war, they may have turned professional earlier. But Ian Hamilton Benn was the man that actually put up the money to buy the famous Valley ground that you can see there, bottom left. It was literally dug out of the community by the community, and that's what I think is important. He re-employed ex-servicemen that were out of work to dig the valley out. Now, unlike a lot of soulless bowls that I go to in outer town developments where they're next to a TGI Fridays and a TK Maxx, the valley still stands in the heart of the community. Now, just bear with me for a moment, because if you look at that photograph, bottom left, you can see that's taken in 1920, the vast East Terrace overlooking towards the River Thames. You can still picture it. That's it, just before the Second World War, when we were getting crowds of 70-odd thousand. The hillock just above the covered end there with the roof was actually the site of a Roman lookout station as well, 2,000 years earlier. Today, you can still make out the same parts of the ground, the east stand away on their right. And so they've still got that character from its original ground. Now, it wasn't without cost. A number of Charlton players were killed in the war. Three that we're going to mention in particular here is Jim Mackenzie, top right, merchant seaman, who was a cook. That was a ship that was sunk in 1917 is on the Tower Hill Memorial. And then Fred Chick at the bottom there in the team group pre-war, is in the nice collar and suit there. He was killed at Highwood with the Middlesex Regiment and is buried in Caterpillar Valley Cemetery. And Nobby Nightingale, that wonderful cartoon that was done for us by Tim Godden to depict him striding forward there, who was a clever halfback who was killed, is buried not far from Messines as well. And 5 of the post-war or the pre-war team in that photograph would go on to wear wound stripes where they were wounded in action. So like every community across the country, we did our bit. Those that joined the 2nd 20th, who was the local battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 20th Londons, would have had a quite incredible journey. They'd have gone initially to France, then to Egypt, then they'd have gone to Salonika, back to Egypt, then they would have served across Palestine. They would have been there for the capture of Jerusalem. They would have gone back to France for the last 100 days of victory, and then ended up in Germany. Quite incredible, really. This picture's the veterans taken in the up on Blackheath at the end of the war, probably when the memorial was unveiled there for Greenwich. And on the right, one of my favourite photographs of the war, that guy in the cut down shorts. Look, it doesn't look black and white. It doesn't look 100 years old, does he? I think they're probably St Pancras riflemen, to be honest, but it depicts the London soldier in that Palestine campaign. They really do look like a tough bunch, but quite an incredible journey. And then they go back to their communities in South London. Now, we do have, we're coming towards conclusion now, but we do have one of the stories from 500 Cockney War Stories. This is a military medal winner from Salonika that says Struma, the Struma Valley there, you can see on the left with the ambulance running through it. On the Struma front in Salonika, I was detailed to take a party of Bulgar prisoners behind the lines. 2 of the Bulgars, one a huge bald-headed man, was carrying a stretcher in which was reposing Ginger Hart of Deptford, who'd been shot through the leg. The white burst of shrapnel continued in our vicinity as we proceeded. One shell burst immediately in front of us and we halted. It was at this junction that I saw Ginger leave his stretcher and hop away off on one leg. Having picked up a tin hat, he hopped back to the big Bulgar prisoner and put the hat on his bald head, saying, "It's about time we put a lid on that suet pudding corp. That's the 5th shot they fired at this target." Wonder what the Bulgar thought of that.
This wonderful letter that I must read out to you, I acquired, a Londoner by a chap of Arthur Box, who various units he served in, ended up in the Bedfordshire Regiment and then again in the Royal Engineers. And look at this officer letter that was written to him when he left the army in 1919. Now the time has come for you to leave the army and return to civil life. I wish both personally and officially to thank you for the service for which you have given. You take away with you the priceless knowledge that you've played a man's part in the great war for freedom and fair play. And you take away with you your remembrances of your comrades, your pride in your unit, and the love of your country. You have played the game, go on playing it, and all will be well with that great empire with which you have helped to save. I wish you every prosperity and happiness. Incredible letter that was to be written by. That officer wrote that to every man in his unit. Well, Arthur actually went back to his pre-war job as a London bus driver. And the use of London buses is quite fascinating in the war. About 1,000 Type B buses were requisitioned by the War Office. That represented 1 in 3 of London transport stock at the time. They were used in lots of different roles, from pigeon lofts, anti-aircraft vehicles. The main one was an easy way of moving troops around the front. A number of them were actually converted to lorries, and the drivers, despite being in arguably a reserved occupation, were given permission to join the armed forces in this role. And one of them is this chap here, Will Adams from Hearn Hill. This is my great-grandfather's brother, Will. He was in the 60th London Division, and there he is ringed in front of his newly requisitioned vehicle that's converted into a truck. He would go on to serve throughout Palestine. Now I'll flip through here because I'm mindful of the time to the real stats that we wanted to share with you. And they are as follows. This is the pre-war populations. London, 7.1 million people. Canada, 7.2 million people. So roughly equivalent. Australia, 5 million. New Zealand, 1 million. And India has 244 million people. Now, when we look at manpower in the armed forces in the Great War, we see that London actually provides over 1 million personnel to the war effort. And Canada, whose contribution cannot be underestimated or overlooked in any way. In fact, it's well heralded, you know, how far they come to take part. But for a similar population, albeit that they didn't have a large freestanding army before the war, provides 650,000. Australia, 300,000, New Zealand, 100,000, and the largest contribution, of course, being from India, 1.3 million troops that were provided. But London, over 1 million troops out of a population of 7.1 million. Now that goes on when we talk about sacrifices as well. This is the memorial to the London soldiers outside the Royal Exchange that commemorates all of their sacrifices. And when we look at deaths in service, 130,000 Londoners killed in the Great War in the armed services. That's roughly equivalent to the losses of Canada and Australia in the Great War. And again, that's not detracting anything away from Canada and Australia's contributions, commitments, and sacrifices. But I find it quite stunning there, that 130,000 from London. I guess what this really points to, as we should say, is that actually 1 in 7 of those in khaki in the BEF, 1 in 7 had links to London, whether they were serving in a London raised unit or were born in London or lived in London at the time of the war. And that 1 in 7 actually plays its way out in perhaps the most famous bravery decoration of them all, where of the 626 Victoria Crosses awarded in the Great War, 81 of them were awarded to people with links to London. So really, you know, this journey, which has been very anecdotal, in parts kind of flippant and what have you, there is a serious side to this. And I think what I'm trying to say in conclusion is that I believe that London's contribution could be considered equal to that of a country as opposed to that of a city. Now, it's one that I'm particularly proud of because of my links, but it doesn't come without sacrifice, because Will Adams the chap who was the London bus driver, doesn't come home to London. This photograph's taken of him in the YMCA in Jerusalem, and unfortunately he dies in the last weeks of the war and is buried in Ramla War Cemetery. Whenever I visit the Palestine campaign, I always go out of my way to visit him. So I think I'd like to dedicate tonight's talk to him and invite Luke back on and take any questions that you may have.
How do you think London's contribution to the Great War is remembered today?
I guess if you're not from London, you probably say that it's well remembered. It's remembered too much. I'd say we probably don't. You know, I'm not one for nationalistic memorials really, but there isn't truly a memorial. There's divisional memorials in France, but there's no memorial to London's contribution yet. It's probably the highest number of people on the Menin Gate, highest number of people at Teetvale Memorial, what have you, because it's such a large city. But there's a wonderful history that was written about London in 1890s. It's like a travel guide to London, and it was written by a chap from Yorkshire, and he opens it by saying, whilst Londoners do talk a lot, they tend not to talk so much about themselves, and that's why I'm writing this story for them. So, I'd like to think that's the case. You know, we know better, no more important than anyone else, but I don't think we go on about it. Might be on the change. I know that there is going to be an exhibition hopefully at the National Army Museum called Cockney Pride, and an academic book being written about London's contribution that I'm going to certainly be part of. So maybe we'll readdress that going forward.
Great, thank you. And it's good to hear a mention of Hearn Hill, which is my neck of the woods.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I only ever went there cycling as a kid. That was where the velodrome was, right?
It is, and still is.
All right.
I've got a comment from Christopher Weeks, who's written that it's not a question, but an appreciation of a fantastic talk, engrossing and showing an amazing capacity for researching. Thanks so much, Clive.
Thanks, Chris. It's only the beginning, though. That there's a lot more to look into this. Really, you need more than a couple of pie charts to prove it. I'm just putting out there an early theory.
Got a question from Tony Stiles. Tony's camera unfortunately isn't working, but I'll field the question on his behalf. Is Sid Godley's VC displayed anywhere today?
Oh, that's a good one, isn't it? I think, isn't it one of the ones that went in the Ashcroft collection?
Right.
I'm pretty certain. Someone might be able to correct me on that. There's old Contemporaries people in the audience, but I'm pretty certain I've seen it at the Imperial War Museum, haven't I? I think so. Yeah. I mean, that's quite some price. £270,000, right? For it is quite something.
Really?
Yeah. There's a block of flats named after him as well, out in somewhere near Leytonstone. But I think that changed its name later on in life. But he is recorded. The BBC have got a recording of him talking about his experiences, I think in the 1950s. It's well worth listening to the audio recording of him talking about him.
Fantastic, thank you. Question for John Lloyd, and John, you should be able to join us and ask your question.
Hi, Clive.
Hi, John.
Thanks for the talk. We have met on one of your tours.
Right.
The question I wanted to ask was, my grandfather, who was joined one of the sportsmen's battalions, which you may remember, became a temporary gentleman halfway through the war. So he went from the Fusiliers, and at the time when I met you, I didn't know where he ended up, but he ended up in the 42nd East Lancashire as a signalman.
Right. Oh, a bright lad then. Yeah.
But I just wondered whether you had any figures for. You mentioned that obviously a lot of them were well educated because they came from the city. Do we know how many did go to become temporary officers, or any figures? And what did the training actually consist of?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that again depended, John, on their academic background. Some of the guys in the Artist Rifles literally were just commissioned into regiments very quickly indeed. But someone like the 42nd East Lancs Division, does he join them post Gallipoli then, when they're on the Western Front?
Yeah, because he was in France before with the Fusiliers, and then
Well, they
went
come back
and
from
then,
yeah. Well,
so
they
he
come
was
back from
doing a bit of an
Gallipoli.
asset then.
Yeah, well, they come back from Gallipoli. They've severely lacking in officers because of the amount of casualties they suffered out there. That division would have had its own officer syllabus. That's a cracking division. They're one of the top divisions for the Second East Lancs. You should be very proud of that. Big fan of them entirely. But with regards to individual figures, you go battalion by battalion.
Right.
And you can look them up and it gives you an idea. I mean, what I'm hoping to do is write more of an academic paper that will break it down into battalion by battalion. So I'll let you know when I do that.
Okay.
But certainly that in that people like the Queen's Westminster Rifles, it's a higher amount than they lose as casualties. You know, so you're talking about thousands of men that enlist that then go on to be commissioned into regiments across the globe. I mean, really, you know, you find them all across, not only in UK or British units, but across the world. Oh, you should be very proud.
Yeah, the reason I was because he actually worked for the post office as a telegraph boy, young man, I suppose, before he went. So you think they were a fairly obvious choice to send into the new business of communication, which changed rapidly during that time. And he had a good war, so he was a lucky chap. When
he enlisted, of course, he'd have gone to the Cecil Hotel because that battalion sportsman was raised by Lady, what's her name, and she would Cunliffe Owen, isn't it? And she'd have sat behind a modesty screen while the doctor made them cough to interview them to make sure they were the right sort.
He came from Northfleet.
Oh, lovely. All right,
Grays in Northfleet. So, and he was you'll be pleased to know, well, when I knew him, which was obviously much older, we were West Ham supporters mainly then, but he was also a keen Charlton man as well.
Well, there you are, a Signaler and a Charlton fan. He had everything going for him, didn't he? Nice to see you again, John.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, and we've got John Bromwich. John, question from you.
Hi, John.
Hi. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you. My grandfather was in the Royal Field Artillery, and he was from Camberwell, and I just wondered if with the Woolwich Arsenal, whether a large percentage of the artillery were Londoners as well. I didn't know if you had...
I'm kicking myself now because that would have significantly added weight to the argument, their contribution. It's if you look at a number of war-raised batteries and artillery field brigades, they come from across the capital, and it is that close proximity to Woolwich to enlist. So Charlie Adams, my great-grandfather there, who's Camberwell lad, he goes into 12th Eastern Division, and a lot of the 12th Eastern Division gunners were from that area of South East London. So he was from, they were from Camberwell New Road, he lived in at the time. And I should just mention about him, there's a lovely little anecdote about the Adamses, is that one of the family goes to America and becomes a cartoonist for New Yorker magazine and comes up with a comic strip about a family of monsters called the Addams Family with a double D, and that's my family name. So we're directly resulted to the Addams family, which I'm really quite proud of, really. I don't know which one I am, but there we are. But yeah, if his service number starts with a 99, your great-grandfather, it sounds like a Kitchener volunteer could well be someone that ends up in the 12th Eastern Division, because a lot of Camberwell men go there.
He was certainly trying to track his records. He was well, I don't know how they, allocated them, but he seemed to be with the 12th Eastern. That's the ace of spades, is it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Isn't that incredible? They might have known each other.
Yeah.
So drop me a line, because I've seriously dropped me a line. You can get easy to find, because one of the things my great-grandfather brought back is a lot of maybe 8 or 9 photographs of his friends, who I don't know who they are, but they are gunners in 12th Eastern Division.
Oh, because I'd love to know more about him, because of, the records were destroyed. I mean, I only got the military medal.
Wow. Okay.
Strangely, also his gun battery. I think somebody got a VC, but there's no, and everyone else was killed apart from this VC winner. There's no mention of my grandfather, so I don't know if he'd run away. But
well, send me some details. It's easy to get hold of me. Just fire battle honours or whatever, fire the WFA, and we can swap some information on that division.
Oh, that'd be great. Thanks so much.
No, nice.
Thank you.
No problem, John.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thanks for your question, John. Just a couple more comments, Clive, in the chat. Richard Owen says Sid is buried in Loughton, Essex.
That's where the block of flats was. That makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
And then Malcolm Pond said Sid Godley's VC is in private, unknown hands, believed to be in the USA.
Right. Okay.
Teddy Noiser said Sid's medal is with the Royal Fusiliers at Tower Hill.
Right. Yeah, they've just shut that. They did the Royal Fusiliers Museum's just shutting and moving. I saw, which is a shame, really. They've got one of the pom-pom guns from the Gallipoli landings on display there, but my understanding is they're about to move the museum, which is a real shame.
And we also have
nice to hear Teddy's online as well. So hi, Teddy.
We also have a comment from Darren O'Brien, who says, fantastic talk, Clive. Like you, I'm a proud Londoner and served with the RRF and the London Scottish in the 1980s and 90s.
Yeah.
What I find
good heritage.
Yeah, is that a few of the London battalions, such as the 22nd Bermondsey Boys and 10th Hackney and the 11th Finsbury Rifles, never published posts or histories of their achievement.
No, it's a shame, really. And in the 11th Finsburys, particularly, because they've got the most stunning memorial just outside Sadler's Wells, the Bally place, which depicts, the scenes from around the globe. And, those battalion Hackneys, they're one of the few units that really serve everywhere. They're even at Gallipoli because they reinforced 54th East Anglian Division. So that, it is a shame that no one's. Maybe there's the next set of MA candidates for Wolverhampton. Someone should pick those battalions and write their story. There's certainly gaps there.
Thank you for your question, Darren. Appreciate it. Tom Martin has just asked, is the figure of 130,000, is that just for the army, or does it include the Royal Navy?
No, it's all three. It's men in the armed forces, actually, because there's a significant naval contribution. In fact, one of the men that got cut through time was Admiral Weems, who has an incredible history before the Great War and during it, and of course is the highest ranking representative in the railway carriage in the signing of the armistice, representing our interests, a Londoner. And there's in fact, it's in Greenwich or Blackheath, Weems Road, with a school named after him as well. But there's a significant naval contribution as well that rightly should be in there.
Great. And we've got one more question from Christopher John, who should be joining us in just a second.
Hi, Clive. Great to see you again.
How are you?
Thank you for an immaculately researched presentation there. It was absolutely fabulous. And even me missus is watching, who's been thoroughly, there
they are.
Thoroughly impressed by it. So there we are. It was just a question really just to say, how did they get your family in particular get on after the war? The homes fit for heroes. We all know that other parts of the country, they came back not to what they expected and no jobs, this sort of thing. Was London still more affluent than that?
No, not. I mean, there's London, isn't there, Chris?
Yes, that is such a big place.
Yeah, so I mean, the areas where we came from, Southeast London, didn't really walk back to much at all. It was they went to. I think what happened is they went to preserve the way of life that they saw it, which was, the preserving the empire and Britain being what it have, and they came back to a very different place. Certainly a lot of the left-leaning, politically motivated veterans groups, a number of them came from Southeast London. I mean, the Battle of Westminster Bridge is quite well documented, which I think starts Thamesmead, Woolwich, and ends up in a full-scale riot. So they were demanding change, and that change came from the top down, because it was as much about my copy of the Second 20th London's, I should say, history, belonged to one of the company commanders, and he writes notes all the way through it. And he was very much involved with his men at the end of the war. And so he went back to his country estate
and his townhouse in Kensington. And when his dad sort of like said, you know, or shouted at a butler or whatever, he would be the person who would say, hang on, Dad, you don't talk to people like that anymore. They were with me. And that change comes from both ways. For us, our way out is very brief. In John Harris, the vet you saw there, and Steve Honeysett, that some of you will know, we share the same anecdote because our family lived in the same street in Charlton, is that they were given a tip in the local pub on the Irish sweep, and it came in. And it meant that in the 1920s, we were able to buy our house. And that is quite something.
Yes.
And Steve still lives in his one. Not so for us. The house that we bought, the Luftwaffe had designs on the place. So we lost it. And with the money that was left over, there was a £1 share in the Garden City Corporation. So they were rehoused in Welling Garden City. And that started the virtual migration out to Hertfordshire, which I've now gone and ruined because we're moving back into the city again. So, you know, these things happen, don't they? So yeah, it was a struggle, but I think that there was a lot of change that came in the 1920s by the people that fought the war, and that's really important. There was the war itself. Yeah.
There wasn't the same sort of agitation that there was up north, where people were fearing communist revolution and things like this.
Well, we were probably the communists, right? So, no, I mean, there had to be change. It had to be change. I mean, if you look at I don't know if you've done anything on the Luton Hat riots. I mean, it's just appalling, some of the things that occur there, and so there has to be change. And I think one of Haig's great victories that he isn't heralded enough for is that Ian Hamilton and Haig being able to get these veterans associations from across the political spectrum, right and left wing, and unite them under the flag of the Royal British Legion. And
RBL, yes.
Yeah, depoliticize them and say, look, we're veterans together, is a massive achievement.
Thank you very much, Clive. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for your question, Christopher. Great. So I think that really brings us to the end of tonight's talk. Clive, really, it just leaves me to say thank you so much again for coming along and giving us an incredibly engaging talk.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm out to play snowmen now. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks to everyone that tuned in tonight. Thank you. Good night.
Cheerio. Bye.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous.